Hello, friends. Tonight, we find ourselves standing in the center of a remote, frozen frontier settlement just as the daylight begins to fail. The cold here settles differently than you might be used to. It doesn't just arrive, it encroaches. It moves quietly and patiently, possessing an ancient confidence that if it waits long enough, it will eventually claim everything. You likely wouldn't survive this environment if you approached the night with a modern mindset, flipping a switch and trusting the furnace to keep the world at bay. Here, there are no switches. There is only timing, deliberate preparation, and the sobering realization that sleep is a compromise you must negotiate with the darkness. Before we settle in, take a brief moment to like the video and subscribe, but do so only if you find value in our journey tonight. I'd love to know where you are listening from and what the clock reads in your part of the world. Now, dim the lights and let yourself step forward into the chill. You arrive at the blue hour, that fleeting moment of dusk that comes much earlier than your instincts anticipate. At this high latitude and deep into the season, the sun doesn't set so much as it retreats, leaving behind a pale violet afterglow that feels abrupt and unfinished. The architecture here is low and utilitarian. The cabins and structures seem pressed into the earth by the weight of the wind and accumulated snow. When the air is still, a rare mercy in these parts, smoke rises in perfectly straight columns from the chimneys. Each of those thin gray lines is a signal telling you that someone inside is frantically preparing for the sun's departure. In these frozen outposts, evening was never a gentle fade into relaxation. It was a deadline. Historical records from northern settlements confirm that winter workdays were cut short not due to physical exhaustion, but because the darkness turned ordinary tasks into lethal hazards. You can feel that pressure hanging in the air right now, the urgent sense that whatever must be accomplished before sleep must be finished immediately. There is no ambient hum of electricity here. There is no distant drone of traffic, nor the reassuring glow of street lamps stretching into the distance. Light exists only where a human hand feeds it fuel. Candles flicker behind thick glass, and lanterns sway rhythmically as doors are quickly opened and bolted shut. Every flame feels temporary, precious, and incredibly fragile against the vastness of the night. Watch how the townspeople move. There is a specific intention in their gait. They are not running, but they certainly aren't lingering. Historians often debate the psychological impact of this rhythm. Did this strict routine create a sense of calm or a perpetual state of anxiety? Standing here, you realize it is a paradox of both. There is calm because every tool and chore has its place in the survival order, but there is anxiety because a single mistake, a forgotten latch, or a wet boot will haunt you through the night. As you step across the threshold into a home, the temperature shift is subtle. It is warmer, certainly, but not in the way a modern thermostat commands a room. The cold is not banished here. It is merely slowed down. This is a crucial distinction. Frontier cabins were not engineered to eliminate winter. They were built to survive it. The walls are thick where the timber allowed, but often thin where resources were scarce. You'll notice the gaps between the logs are aggressively stuffed with whatever material could be spared. Strips of old wool, dried moss, or layers of newspaper if the supply train had come recently. A fascinating historical detail often overlooked is that some settlers specifically packed their walls with straw taken from stable floors. The belief was that the straw, having been under livestock, carried a residual warmth and density that fresh straw lacked. Whether this was scientific fact or desperate folklore,
It was repeated often enough to become a standard practice of insulation. You begin to understand that the process of sleeping here begins hours before anyone actually closes their eyes. Heavy leather boots are placed near the embers to dry, close enough to warm, but never so close that the leather cracks. Clothing is rearranged rather than removed. Food is prepped with tomorrow morning's hunger in mind.
The modern concept of pajamas would be absurd here. Most inhabitants slept in a modified version of their daily workwear, shedding only the outermost heavy coats and adding wool blankets in their place. It was a layering of defenses rather than a change of identity. While scholars analyze how this impacted hygiene and comfort, the reasoning was practical. In a place where fire or freezing were constant threats, you had to be ready to move the moment you woke up. Sound behaves differently as the light dies. Outside, the deep snow acts as a massive acoustic dampener, swallowing footsteps and dulling the horizon. But inside, the silence amplifies everything. The scrape of a chair leg on rough floorboards sounds like a shout. The clink of a cast-iron pot arrests all conversation. You sense an unspoken social contract to keep voices low, not merely out of politeness, but because silence allows you to monitor the environment. In a drafty cabin, listening was a survival skill equal to hunting or chopping wood. You needed to hear the wind changing direction, the groan of a roof beam, or the shallow breathing of a sick child. As the interior grows darker, the family clusters their activities tightly around the hearth or cast-iron stove. This isn't just for togetherness, it is an exercise in efficiency. Firelight and heat obey the inverse square law. They reach only so far, and you do not waste them. Diaries from trading posts and homesteads frequently mention families extinguishing their final candle far earlier than they wanted to, simply to conserve the tallow. Light was expensive, and an unattended fire was a catastrophe waiting to happen. You feel the room dim, and you realize that sleep is coming whether you are mentally prepared for it or not. Fear is present in the room, but it is disciplined. You hear it in the way conversations taper off softly, lacking formal good nights. Everyone is acutely aware of what the darkness implies. Illnesses always seem to spike in severity after the sun goes down. Weather shifts feel more dramatic when you cannot see the clouds gathering. And yet, they lie down anyway. They have learned the hard lesson of the frontier. Waiting up does not make the night any shorter. It only makes you colder. You finally settle onto a sleeping surface that a modern back would hardly recognize as a bed. It might be a ticking mattress stuffed with crushed straw, or perhaps a stiff pile of furs. In this environment, the definition of comfort is radically recalibrated. It is not measured in softness or thread count, but in thermal retention, structural stability, and the simple absence of a biting draft. Historians and anthropologists remain divided on the quality of rest achieved in these conditions. Did the frontier dwellers sleep more lightly, constantly badgered by the harsh conditions? Or did the sheer physical exhaustion of survival labor push them into a comatose state deeper than anything we experience in the modern world? You test the surface beneath you, feeling the lumpy topography of the mattress, and you realize your body will adjust simply because it has no other choice. Outside, the final lantern in the settlement is blown out. The town effectively folds in on itself, erasing the boundary between the streets and the wilderness. There are no street lights to push back the void. The night here is absolute. You become acutely aware of your own physiology, the rhythm of your breathing, the heavy weight of your wool clothing, and the slow, dying radiation of heat from the hearth as the logs settle into glowing embers. This is how sleep begins here, not with relaxation, but with resignation. You let your eyes close,
understanding that the morning sun will return on its own schedule, indifferent to your desires. As the sub-zero air presses gently but insistently against the logs, you feel yourself crossing a threshold into the specific kind of rest that the frontier demanded. It is not perfect, and it is certainly not soft, but it is enough to keep you alive.
Sometime in the darkness, you wake briefly. It isn't because of a threat, but because the building itself is moving. As the temperature plummets, the wood fibers contract and tighten. The joints of the cabin complain with soft pops and groans, sounds that mimic footsteps. Frontier homes were animate objects in this way, responding to the cold much like a human body responds to pain, tensing up to preserve integrity. You lie still and listen, learning to diagnose the structure through sound alone. You remember that these buildings were never designed to be hermetically sealed. They were built to breathe. While modern insulation standards aim for airtight efficiency, in a heated timber cabin, that would have been a death sentence. A well-documented reality of the era is that trapped smoke and stale, moisture-heavy air were often far more lethal than the cold. Consumption and carbon monoxide thrived in stagnant rooms. You visualize the anatomy of the shelter around you: logs notched by hand with axes, boards sawn into uneven planks, and fieldstones stacked with care but lacking geometric precision. Each of these materials expands and contracts at a different metabolic rate. As the night deepens, tiny apertures open and close in the walls. Instead of fighting this dynamic, the settlers worked in concert with it. They didn't try to eliminate airflow, they tried to captain it. Drafts were guided, not stopped. Heavy quilts or animal skins were hung over doorways to act as thermal airlocks. Furniture was strategically placed to break the current of wind. Beds were shoved toward the center of the room, away from the frosted exterior walls. These interior design choices were not aesthetic. They were tactical maneuvers to survive until dawn. Lying there, you become sensitive to the fluid dynamics of the room. Cold air behaves like water. It is heavy and dense, seeping in low and sliding along the floorboards. Meanwhile, the precious warm air gathers in a distinct layer near the rafters. Settlers understood the physics of convection long before they had the vocabulary to explain it scientifically. A fascinating detail found in various frontier journals describes how families would store their most temperature-sensitive tools or drying herbs on high shelves, not just for storage, but because the air was physically kinder up there. Whether they understood the science of rising heat or simply learned it through the shivering trial and error of experience, the result was the same. It was knowledge built entirely from sensation. You adjust your position, rolling slightly closer to the room's center. Even that micro-movement changes the thermal equation. Sleep here is an active, responsive state. You do not sink into oblivion and forget the world. You remain tethered to it. You stay lightly aware, ready to pull a blanket tighter, tuck your feet in, or wake if the fire dies down too low. Scholars debate whether this state of vigilant rest constituted sleep deprivation or if it was simply a different, perhaps more natural biological rhythm. From the inside, it doesn't feel like a lack of sleep. It feels purposeful, like resting while standing guard over your own life. The walls protecting you were often composed of more than just timber. In regions where trees were sparse, the walls might be constructed from sod, bricks of earth and grass roots stacked thick and heavy, holding the frost at bay through sheer earthen mass. In other areas, cabins utilized a double wall technique, with packed earth, sawdust, or debris stuffed between two layers of wood.
There is a mainstream historical account from the northern plains describing walls stuffed with dried prairie grass and old rags, a form of insulation that had to be renewed every autumn like a ritual. The smell of that dried grass would linger in the room, earthy, faintly sweet and dusty. You can almost imagine that scent now, filling your lungs as you breathe in the dark.
Finally, you notice how the total absence of light changes the geometry of the room. Without visual cues, space becomes tactile. The edge of the bed is defined only by where your hand falls off. The location of the hearth is known only by the faint radiant heat hitting your cheek. Everything else fades into suggestion. People learned their homes by heart in the truest sense. They could navigate the floor plan while half asleep, guided entirely by muscle memory and touch. While historians argue whether this heightened sensory awareness made settlers more anxious, it undeniably made them capable. Outside, the wind begins to actively test the structure, probing the corners and eaves for any sign of weakness. It whistles briefly at a seam in the logs, finds no entry, and moves on. You do not panic at the sound. You have heard this conversation before. In the frontier, wind is not just weather, it is information. A low, consistent moan usually indicates steady, dry cold. A sharp, erratic rattle against the roof often signals that snow is driving hard behind it. This kind of acoustic literacy was common enough that children learned it before they could read, absorbing the cues of the storm the way modern children learn the specific chirps of notification sounds. It wasn't romantic folklore, it was practical data stream. You feel the floor beneath you radiating cold, even through your layers. The settlers knew this physics intimately, and it is the primary reason many slept on raised wooden platforms or thick pallets. Cold air is heavy. It sinks and settles like water at the lowest point of the room, while warmth drifts jealously upward. This simple observation dictated furniture design in places where winter dominated life. A lesser-known detail from trading post inventories reveals that raised wooden bed frames were often valued not for their comfort or status, but purely for their insulating elevation. You feel a profound gratitude for every inch of vertical space separating you from the frozen ground. As the night settles further, the house finds its thermal equilibrium. The sharpest, biting cold passes, replaced by a steady, pervasive chill that no longer surprises you. Your breathing slows to match the room. You instinctively tuck your chin toward your chest, protecting the warmth of your throat, a habit learned without instruction. Sleep returns, but it comes in shallow waves, broken, vigilant, but sufficient. You understand now that these homes were not shelters in the absolute modern sense. They were compromises, negotiations between human frailty and environmental force. They did not conquer winter, they merely endured it. And lying here, wrapped in that realization, you let your body follow the same logic. You become aware of the light before you actually miss it. That sounds strange, but it is true here. Light is a resource you track, manage, and eventually surrender. As evening deepens into night, every flame carries a calculated weight. You watch the candles shorten and the wicks curl with the same focused attention you give to the weather. Lantern glass clouds slightly with soot, dimming the output. In frozen frontier towns, light determined not just what you could see, but how long you could safely remain conscious. A well-established historical fact shows that most households rationed artificial light with extreme discipline. In the dead of winter, families often limited illumination to a single room after dusk. You sit near the last active flame and notice how it reshapes human behavior. Movements slow down. Tasks simplify. People stop doing anything that requires fine precision.
Mending ends, writing pauses, and even conversation softens, not out of reverence, but because faces become harder to read. Shadows exaggerate expressions, and in the flickering gloom, misunderstandings come easily. You feel how the darkness presses people toward rest, not by force, but by simple inconvenience. The candles themselves were often unreliable companions. Tallow candles, the standard for the common settler, smoked heavily and smelled faintly of the animal fat they were made from. Beeswax burned cleaner and brighter, but it cost significantly more and was often hoarded for church or special occasions. A quirky detail tucked into old household accounts mentions that some families trimmed their wicks obsessively, believing that an uneven burn invited bad luck or illness during the night. Whether this was genuine superstition or just a habit born of frugality, the result was a careful, almost ceremonial attention to the flame. As the candle gutters lower, you notice how your eyes adapt. At first, the encroaching darkness feels sudden and blinding. Then, shapes reappear. The room outlines itself in grayscale. You can tell where the walls meet the floor, not by sight, but by subtle shifts in sound and airflow. Historians still argue whether people in pre-electric environments developed biologically stronger night vision or simply learned to trust their other senses more deeply. Lying here, the second explanation feels more true. You aren't seeing better, you are seeing differently. Eventually, the choice arrives. Do you keep the light a little longer or let it go? This decision carried real consequences. A fire left burning unattended was a massive liability. Candles could tip, sparks could pop from the stove. Mainstream historical records from early town ordinances show repeated fines levied for the careless use of fire after dark. Sleep was safer when the house went fully dark. The flame is finally extinguished. It happens not dramatically, but with a quiet pinch or a quick breath.
The darkness becomes complete. It is not empty, however. It is full. Sound steps forward to fill the space that light has vacated. You hear the shift of fabric as someone turns. A floorboard settles back into place. Someone clears their throat. These small noises orient you, creating a sonic map of where you are and who shares the dark with you. Without light, time stretches and warps. You cannot glance at a clock. You measure the passing moments by internal cues. Breathing slows, muscles loosen, and thoughts begin to drift untethered. People often assume that frontier sleep began the moment the sun went down, but scholars continue to debate this. Evidence suggests that people often lingered awake in the absolute darkness, talking softly or thinking quietly, simply because there was no distraction to push them immediately into slumber. The night stretches out before you, long and unhurried. There is no rush because there is nowhere else to go. You lie down fully now, your movements guided entirely by memory rather than sight. Your hands know exactly where the heavy blankets fold. Your feet find the familiar rough edges of the frame without searching. There is a profound comfort in this tactile knowledge. The house has been learned through the repetitive friction of daily life, and even in this total obscurity, it feels navigable. Children in these settlements learned this spatial awareness early, crawling and later walking through pitch-black rooms, building a physical confidence in the dark that would last well into adulthood. Outside, the town effectively disappears. No lanterns mark the streets. No warm glow spills from windows to guide a traveler. From a distance, the settlement becomes indistinguishable from the frozen wildlands surrounding it. This invisibility was often intentional. In volatile border regions, darkness offered the best protection against raids or unwanted eyes. In quieter places,
It simply conserved precious fuel. But regardless of the motive, the night erased all boundaries. As sleep approaches, you realize that darkness here is not an enemy to be fought. It is a condition, an environmental state you accept and work within. Modern life treats darkness as an absence, a void to be filled with artificial light. Frontier life treated it as a presence, a tangible weight that demanded respect, adjustment, and eventually trust. Your thoughts slow down. Without the visual stimulation of the world to pull them outward, they turn inward. The last images of the day fade. The night holds you steady and unremarkable, and you begin to drift into a rest shaped by shadows rather than screens. You settle more heavily now, letting your full weight sink into what passes for a bed in this place. It is not soft. It does not yield generously to your form. Instead, it meets you with a distinct firmness and familiarity. Dry straw crackles faintly beneath the fabric ticking. The wooden boards hold steady. Heavy hides give just enough to remind you that an animal once carried this warmth through a winter of its own.
In frozen frontier towns, sleep surfaces were chosen for availability and insulation, never for luxury. Period accounts and estate inventories consistently note that mattresses, as we imagine them today, were rare commodities, often reserved strictly for the ill or the wealthy. Most people slept on layered materials they could repair, replace, or rearrange as the season dictated. You notice how your body adapts to the surface. Muscles shift and settle. Pressure points fade as your circulation finds new paths. There is a lingering modern assumption that people in the past slept poorly because their beds were uncomfortable. Yet many personal letters from the era suggest something else entirely. People described falling asleep almost instantly, worn down by the sheer physics of hard labor and long exposure to the cold. The body, when truly tired, accepts whatever mercy it is given. Straw mattresses were the standard wherever grain was grown. They were stuffed tightly into canvas sacks, sewn shut, and refreshed when they flattened too much. An odd but well-documented habit involved turning these straw mattresses regularly, not just to fluff them back into shape, but to discourage insects from settling too deeply into the core. Even in winter, this mattered. The cold slowed pests down, but it did not eliminate them. Cleanliness was simply another layer of comfort. In regions where straw was scarce, ingenious alternatives appeared. Pine boughs were laid thickly to create a springy base, giving off a faint resinous scent that filled the room. Dried river grasses, old clothing folded into stacks, or corn husks, each material carried its own specific sound and smell. These sensory cues became an integral part of the sleep environment. You breathe in now, and you notice the air carries traces of wood smoke, heavy fabric, and dried earth. It is not unpleasant, it is simply grounded. There is continuing disagreement among social historians about how often these sleeping surfaces were shared by necessity rather than choice. The evidence points both ways. In some households, each person claimed a defined, humble spot. In others, beds were communal by default, expanding and contracting as family circumstances changed. Tonight, you feel how the proximity to another body adds a crucial layer of warmth, even without direct touch. Heat radiates quietly across the gap, often making the difference between shivering and stillness.
You adjust your blankets, layering them with the specific technique people here learn from childhood. Heavy insulation on the bottom, lighter layers on top. This arrangement traps dead air underneath you and reduces the compression that steals heat. Such techniques were passed along casually, learned by watching rather than through instruction. A lesser-known note from a northern settlement journal mentions that newcomers often piled their blankets incorrectly, only to be corrected gently by those who had already endured a few winters.
The bed itself sits slightly raised, and you are thankful for it. Even a few inches of elevation matter. Cold air gathers low, creeping along the floorboards like water filling a basin. This is why crude pallets, frames, and even simple wooden slats were prized possessions. Surviving inventories from frontier stores list bed frames not as furniture, but as essential survival goods. The true value of this furniture lies not in its aesthetics, but in its altitude, its ability to separate you from the frozen earth. As you lie still, you begin to understand how the bed itself dictates the terms of your night. Movement is strictly minimized. To toss and turn is to flush out the pocket of warm air you have painstakingly generated. People here learn to settle with deliberation, choosing a position they can maintain for hours without shifting. This is why side sleeping, often curled slightly in a fetal tuck, appears so frequently in historical descriptions of the era. It wasn't just preference, it was physics. By reducing your surface area, you conserve heat and protect your vital organs. While academic opinion has never fully settled on how these rigid sleeping habits influenced long-term orthopedic health, they undeniably served the immediate need of keeping blood warm. The firmness beneath you keeps you acutely aware of your own anatomy. You are not tense, but you are present. There is a specific reassurance in feeling exactly where you are supported. Modern beds invite you to sink, to float, and to forget the physical world. These beds invite awareness and rest, a different experience, but not necessarily a worse one. Your breathing evens out. The palate holds you, not gently, but reliably. And as the night deepens, you understand that comfort here is not about indulgence, it is about enough. Enough warmth, enough stability, and enough recovery to rise and work again. You do not undress for sleep in the way a modern mind expects. Instead, you simply become heavier. In this environment, clothing is not something you shed at the end of the day. It is something you reorganize. The ritual involves loosening layers rather than removing them, adjusting the fabric so it lies flat and traps warmth without cutting off circulation. In cold frontier towns, nightwear was often just daywear rearranged. Period descriptions repeatedly confirm that settlers slept in their shirts, trousers, chemises, wool stockings, and even heavy coats during the deepest freeze of January. You pull a sleeve smooth to ensure it doesn't bunch beneath your ribs. A wrinkle here is not just an annoyance. Over 8 hours, it becomes a bruise, pressing against the skin and stealing heat. This kind of tactile attention becomes automatic. In fact, the strategy begins hours earlier. Clothes are chosen in the morning with the night in mind. Wool is worn closest to the skin whenever possible for its heat retention. Linen is worn beneath if the wool is too scratchy. Cotton, when available, was a luxury, but often avoided in winter because it turned cold and clammy with the slightest sweat. People knew which fabrics befriended them and which turned treacherous. That knowledge came from shivering experience, not instruction manuals. Footwear changes, but it does not disappear. Socks are doubled up.
Sometimes improvised foot wraps made of flannel are added. In some regions, the elderly and children, whose circulation struggled against the drop in temperature, slept in soft deerskin moccasins or knit slippers. One small but fascinating detail appears in several surviving letters from winter settlers: the practice of safety pinning socks to trousers. It sounds fussy and over-anxious until you imagine the reality of waking up at 3 a.m. with exposed, frozen toes and no easy way to warm them in the dark.
Head coverings remain strictly in place: knitted caps, bonnets, or swaths of wrapped cloth. Heat escapes upward, a fact people felt instinctively long before thermodynamics measured it. There is a long-standing debate among historians about exactly how much heat is lost through the head compared to the rest of the body, but in severe climates, the practice of covering it was universal. Tonight, you tuck the fabric down around your ears and feel the immediate difference in temperature. Belts are loosened and buttons are undone just enough to allow your breathing to deepen without restriction. The goal is containment, not constriction. You want the warmth to stay close, but you need your blood to move freely. A diary from a mountain settlement notes that greenhorns, newcomers, often slept too tightly bundled and woke up numb, while the veterans dressed more thoughtfully and slept soundly. As you lie back, you notice how your clothing effectively becomes part of the bedding itself. Sleeves overlap with blankets, skirts drape over edges, coats are folded and placed strategically over legs or shoulders to add weight. Nothing is wasted. Everything serves a dual purpose: protection by day, insulation by night. This constant utility shaped how garments were made. Seams were reinforced, and fabric was chosen for durability, forcing fashion to bend the knee to function.
There is a quiet, grounding comfort in this continuity. You do not change roles or identities when you lie down. You are the same person horizontal as you were vertical. Scholars remain divided on whether this blurred boundary between day and night affected people's sense of self. But from inside the experience, it feels stabilizing. There is no abrupt shift, just a gradual settling. You shift once more, tucking the rough wool collar under your chin. The smell of wood smoke, lanolin, and dried herbs surrounds you. It is familiar. Clothing here carries memory. It holds the scent of the work you did, the weather you walked through, and the fire you sat by. As you breathe, you feel warmed not just by the layers, but by what they represent: preparation, experience, and survival skills learned over time. Sleep arrives wrapped in cloth. You are dressed for it. And in a place like this, that preparedness makes all the difference. You are not alone in this room, and that is not an accident. Sleep in frozen frontier towns was rarely a solitary act. Solitary sleep is a modern luxury. Here, it is a thermal liability. Warmth was shared the same way food, tools, and labor were shared, as a purely practical response to limited resources. Household accounts from the Northern Territories repeatedly describe entire families sleeping in a single room through the winter, even when the house had other rooms available. It was not crowding, it was strategy. You feel the presence of bodies nearby, not pressed uncomfortably tight, but close enough that the zones of radiant heat overlap. Each person acts as a small furnace, contributing to the collective temperature of the space. At first, this closeness might feel intrusive to modern instincts that prize personal space. Elbows touch, someone shifts, and the straw mattress transfers the movement to everyone else. But over time, families learned to arrange themselves with intuitive care. Movements became smaller and more efficient. Positions were negotiated without a word being spoken. Children were placed with deliberate intent.
Records from northern settlements often mention that the youngest were tucked between adults or positioned toward the center of the pallet. The reasoning was simple physics. Smaller bodies lose heat faster due to surface area to mass ratios. The adults formed a living barrier against the drafts. This pattern appears again and again in letters and recollections, not as a strict rule, but as common sense survival. You adjust slightly to accommodate the person breathing beside you. No one apologizes. This is expected. Sleep here is a cooperative effort. A lesser-known observation from a traveling minister in the 1800s noted that frontier families developed what he called an instinctive choreography at night, the ability to shift and turn in unison to stay warm without fully waking one another. It was a skill learned through the repetition of deep winter.
Privacy meant something different in these spaces. It was not defined by physical distance or walls, but by trust and ignoring what didn't need to be noticed. Being close didn't feel intrusive, it felt protective. There is ongoing disagreement among social historians about whether this constant proximity strengthened family bonds or simply reflected necessity. From where you lie, it feels like both. You are aware of the others, but not burdened by them. The room seems to shrink comfortably around the sleeping group. Blankets are overlapped to seal the gaps, edges are tucked carefully to block air movement. Someone places a rolled coat along the wall side where the draft feels coldest. These small adjustments happen almost unconsciously. Everyone here has done this before. The night teaches you quickly. Breathing becomes a shared rhythm, not synchronized exactly, but close enough that you notice when someone sighs or shifts. Sound carries differently when people are near. A cough is felt in the mattress as much as it is heard. This awareness allowed families to notice illness or distress instantly, a crucial advantage in places where the nearest doctor might be 3 days' ride away. There is a persistent modern idea that such sleeping arrangements were miserable or awkward, yet many first-hand descriptions suggest otherwise. People wrote about winter nights as quiet, close, and oddly reassuring despite the danger outside. Comfort came not from space, but from presence. Scholars still explore how this influenced emotional resilience, but it clearly reduced physical risk.
As the night deepens, movement slows further. Everyone settles into positions that can be held for hours. You feel the warmth accumulate, not dramatically, but steadily. The lethal cold outside still exists. You know it is waiting just beyond the timber walls. But inside this small circle, it is held at bay. You let your eyes close again, surrounded by steady breathing and shared heat. Sleep here is not something you do alone. It is something you enter together. You notice the fire long before you look at it, not the flames, but the feeling it leaves behind, a gentle, dying warmth that lingers even as the light fades. In frozen frontier towns, the nighttime fire was never meant to impress, it was meant to behave. Household journals and settlement reports make it clear that fires were banked, deliberately covered with ash to reduce them to smoldering coals rather than open flames. You watch someone tend the fire with a care that borders on affection. While a roaring hearth might look comforting in a painting, in reality it is a liability. A large fire burns through precious fuel too quickly and invites danger. Instead, you watch the process of banking. Ashes are shifted carefully to cover the coals, and a single hardwood log is turned just enough to maintain a dull, steady glow.
No one adds more wood than is strictly necessary. Excess heat is deceptive. It dries out the air and creates a vacuum effect, pulling fresh drafts of freezing air in through the gaps in the logs. People learned this physics the hard way. Entire cabins were lost to fires that grew too ambitious after dark.
Quiet heat was always safer than dramatic warmth. The placement of the fire is strategic. It sits where the warmth can radiate evenly without scorching those sleeping closest to it. Beds are arranged just far enough away to be safe from errant sparks, yet close enough to feel the thermal reach. Tools, shovels, buckets, pokers rest nearby, ready in case the ally turns into a threat. This vigilance never fully disappears, even in sleep. There is a deeply ingrained understanding that fire is a wild thing held in temporary captivity. Something easily overlooked in modern retellings is how much people relied on embers rather than open flames. Coals held their heat longer and released it more predictably. They glowed through the long night, offering just enough warmth to prevent freezing without demanding constant refueling. Some winter accounts describe the specific technique of burying embers deep under a mound of ash, starving them of just enough oxygen to keep them smoldering until morning. The technique sounds simple, but mastering the ratio of ash to air took years of practice.
You lie down knowing the fire will not keep watch for you. It has been prepared to endure, not to dazzle. This realization changes how you rest. You trust the process rather than the spectacle. There is a calm in that trust. Interpretations remain split on whether frontier families slept more lightly because of the ever-present risk of house fires, or if they slept more deeply because physical exhaustion simply overruled their concern. From inside the room, it feels like a balance. You are aware enough to notice a change in the light or sound, but tired enough to let go. The air carries a steady, heavy scent of hardwood smoke and ash, softened by the smell of wool and rough timber. It settles into everything: your clothing, your hair, your blankets. People carried this smell with them like a passport. It was a marker of shelter and survival. Even outdoors, it lingered faintly on the skin, a reminder that warmth was waiting somewhere nearby. As the fire settles further, the room grows quieter. It isn't getting colder exactly, it is getting steadier. The sharp, aggressive edge of the heat fades, replaced by a slow, reliable warmth that feels earned. You adjust once more, pulling the blanket closer, and then you still yourself. The embers glow softly, unseen beneath their blanket of ash, but felt. They do their work without calling attention to themselves. You follow their example. Rest here is not dramatic, it is deliberate. And as the fire rests, so do you. You become aware of your breathing in a way you usually never do. The cold makes breath visible. Even indoors, a faint white cloud appears and disappears with each slow cycle of your lungs. In places like this, breathing is not a passive, autonomic function. It is something you manage. Winter journals and medical notes from frontier regions repeatedly point out that people learned to draw air in exclusively through the nose, warming and humidifying it before it reached the sensitive tissue of the lungs. Mouth breathing was a novice mistake. It chilled the body core faster and left throats raw and swollen by morning. You test this instinctively. In through the nose, slow, controlled. You feel the difference immediately. The air still carries the bite of the frost, but it no longer stings. By the time it reaches your chest, it has been softened and filtered. Children were taught this early, not through lectures, but through correction and example. A sharp inhale through the mouth would earn a quiet reminder from an elder: breathe properly. It mattered. The room responds to breath as well. Sound travels on it. A sigh carries farther than expected in the crisp air. A cough echoes softly against the wooden walls. You learn to breathe quietly, not out of courtesy, but because noise feels larger in the dark. Stillness helps preserve the thermal layer you've built.
One detail that rarely makes it into popular stories appears in several winter camp descriptions. People sometimes slept with a wool scarf or a folded cloth lightly covering their mouth and nose. It wasn't tight, just enough to catch the warmth of the exhale and recycle it on the next breath. It functioned as a primitive heat exchanger. It seems simple, but those who practiced it swore by the difference it made through the deepest hours of the night. There has never been full agreement among researchers on how much these breathing habits affected overall body temperature compared to clothing or bedding. Some argue the effect was minimal. Others believe it played a meaningful role, especially for vulnerable children and elders. Lying here, you sense that even small advantages mattered when the conditions were severe. The cold air also changes how your lungs feel over time. Breaths grow slower and deeper. You cannot rush them without discomfort. This physiological restraint naturally eases you toward rest. Modern sleep guides talk about controlled breathing as a mindfulness technique. Here, it was a biological necessity that produced the same result. Calm followed function. You notice how the rhythm of breathing shapes the room. Several people inhale and exhale at slightly different tempos, creating a gentle, uneven pattern, a polyrhythm of rest. It is oddly soothing, not synchronized, but close enough to feel communal. This shared sound becomes the soundtrack of the night, replacing the daytime chatter.
When someone stirs, their breath changes first, becoming faster or shallower. That sonic shift draws quiet attention in the dark. In this way, breathing served as an early warning system. Illness often announced itself through the altered rasp of respiration long before visible symptoms appeared. Being attuned to this rhythm mattered in towns where doctors were days away. As you settle further, your own breathing evens out to join the chorus. Each inhale feels deliberate. Each exhale releases a little more tension from your shoulders. The cold still exists, you know that, but it no longer dominates your awareness. Breath becomes a bridge between the body and the night, regulating both. You let that rhythm carry you deeper. In, out, steady. Warmth gathers where it can. Sleep follows close behind, arriving not suddenly, but gradually, carried on breath shaped by winter itself. You go to sleep with a full stomach, but not a heavy one. Food here is chosen for how it behaves over time, not how it tastes in the moment. Evening meals in frozen frontier towns were deliberate, dense, and often repetitive. Surviving household logs and winter supply lists show a clear pattern. People favored foods rich in animal fats and slow-burning calories before bed. They understood, through shivering experience, that digestion generated warmth long after the fire dimmed. You feel that warmth now, thermogenesis spreading quietly from the inside out, rather than pressing in from the outside. It is different from the radiant heat of embers. It is slower, deeper, and more reliable. Earlier, you ate carefully. Perhaps it was meat cooked down with suet, or bread baked dense and dry, or a bit of preserved root vegetable if the cellar was holding up. Nothing flashy, nothing wasted. This was fuel, not indulgence. As you lie still, digestion becomes something you can physically sense. It is a low internal hum, a gentle metabolic steadiness that makes the ambient cold feel less sharp. People noticed this biology long before anyone explained metabolism to them. Winter diaries frequently mention eating heavier suppers during the coldest months, often without explanation, as if the reason were obvious. You simply slept better when your body had something to work with. One small but telling habit appears in several frontier accounts. Some families deliberately saved a portion of their supper to eat just before lying down, even if it meant going hungry earlier in the evening.
The belief was that falling asleep on fresh fuel kept the chills away longer. Whether this was scientifically optimal remains uncertain, but those who practiced it trusted the result.
Interpretations among historians diverge on how much nighttime warmth actually came from food compared to clothing and bedding. Some argue the effect was modest. Others suggest it was significant during long sub-zero nights where every calorie counted. From where you are, it feels meaningful enough to notice. Hunger here is not dramatic. It is a quiet drain that makes rest harder to hold. Fullness restores the balance. Meals are often eaten earlier than a modern clock would dictate. Darkness limited activity, not appetite. People planned suppers around the fading light. Afterward, kitchens were cleaned quickly, and water-drawn tasks were finished before fingers became stiff with cold. By the time sleep approached, the work of eating was already supporting the work of resting. They also understood the danger of excess. Overeating was avoided because too much food made the body restless and uncomfortable, diverting too much blood flow to the stomach. Balance mattered. A steady burn was the goal. This understanding came through trial, not theory. People learned what carried them through the night by paying attention to how they felt when they woke up. As digestion continues, you feel your muscles loosen slightly. The cold still presses at the edges of your awareness, but it no longer demands constant adjustment. This internal heat allows for stillness. It buys you time. You start to shift your weight, then arrest the movement halfway. You stop yourself because you remember the cost. Movement is energy expenditure. People learn this equation quickly here. Once you are settled, it is best to remain so. The body is doing its quiet, heavy work of digestion and thermoregulation. Let it be. Your breathing slows further. The warmth generated from the heavy meal and the shared space gathers gently around you. Sleep arrives not merely as an escape from hunger, but as a necessary companion to nourishment. In places like this, eating and sleeping were never separate acts. They were two gears in the same survival mechanism. You notice the silence first, but then you realize it is not true silence at all. It is a fullness without movement. Frozen frontier towns never went quiet in the absolute vacuum-like sense. Instead, the sound thinned out and spread differently, as if the sub-zero air itself were freezing the noise in place. When you lie awake for a moment, you begin to hear things you would ignore during the bustle of the day. A roof beam settling under the load of snow, the wind brushing granular ice against the outer wall like sandpaper, a distant animal shifting its weight in the brush somewhere beyond the dark. Inside the room, the acoustics are microscopic. Every small noise feels amplified. The friction of fabric sliding against straw, someone clearing their throat, the faint, sharp pop of a cooling ember in the stove. People living this way quickly developed a sophisticated auditory literacy. They learned which sounds mattered and which did not. This skill was never written down in manuals, but it appears again and again in winter recollections. Those who slept through blizzards knew the difference between the harmless groan of timber and the warning crack of a failing joint. You keep your body still and listen. Stillness sharpens hearing. Moving not only wastes warmth, it scatters your attention. That lesson appears quietly across many frontier accounts. People describe nights spent awake not in fear, but in a state of high-fidelity awareness. Listening was part of rest. You did not shut the world out completely. You monitored it lightly, the way a sentry sleeps with one eye half open.
One unexpected habit surfaces in several winter stories. Families would sometimes place small objects near doors or window shutters at night, not as locks, but as sound traps. A tin cup balanced on a latch, a loose bucket against the doorframe. If something moved outside, the object would fall and announce the intrusion. This was not paranoia, it was simple, low-tech engineering. It was an extension of listening. Knowing you would hear a disturbance made it easier to let go and sleep.
There has never been full clarity on whether such alertness disrupted rest or improved it. Modern sleep science often treats vigilance as the enemy of deep sleep. Yet people in these towns did not describe themselves as exhausted by listening. Instead, they wrote about feeling reassured by the familiar soundscape. When everything sounded as it should, they rested more easily. The cold shapes the acoustics too. Outside, the deep, porous snow absorbs noise, dampening the world and making it feel closer and smaller. But indoors, the dry, frozen wood carries sound with startling efficiency. A cough in one corner reaches everyone. This acoustic closeness encouraged a culture of restraint. People learned to move with extreme care at night, not just to avoid waking others out of politeness, but because any disturbance rippled instantly through the shared space. You notice how your mind categorizes these sounds automatically. That creak is the floor, normal. That wind gust is expected. That long pause between noises means nothing has changed. This quiet mental sorting calms you. It gives shape and boundary to the darkness. The unknown becomes familiar through repetition. Some later observers assume these nights must have been terrifying. Complete darkness, limited protection, harsh weather. Yet personal accounts often describe something else entirely, a sense of being held inside a known pattern. The night behaved predictably most of the time, and when it did not, people were awake enough to respond. As you listen now, your thoughts slow down. The isolated sounds blend into a steady, reassuring background drone. Nothing demands action. Nothing breaks the rhythm. The house holds. The town sleeps. Eventually, even the listening softens. The distinct sounds recede into a gentle blur. Awareness loosens its grip. You are no longer monitoring the night. You have become part of it. And in that shared stillness, sleep deepens, carried not by silence, but by the reassurance of familiar noise fading into rest. Fear does not arrive loudly here. It seeps in the way the cold does, gradually, finding the cracks when you are tired enough to notice the gaps in your thoughts. You feel it most when everything else settles, when the wind pauses, when the fire stops murmuring, when the room feels almost too still. In frozen frontier towns, managing fear was just as critical as managing heat. Panic is a high-calorie emotion. It burns through energy reserves fast and leaves the body trembling and weaker by morning. People living this way learned early that fear had immediate physical consequences. Fast, anxious breathing chilled the chest cavity. Tense muscles restricted blood flow and pulled warmth away from the core. Sleeplessness made the next day's labor harder, which made the next night's survival more precarious. Winter journals and medical notes from remote settlements make an unspoken point clear. Staying calm in these conditions was not about bravery, it was about endurance. You notice how strict routines help stabilize the room. Small, repeatable actions anchor the mind against the drift of panic. Someone checks the door latch one last time, even though they checked it 10 minutes ago. Another adjusts the edge of a blanket with unnecessary precision. A quiet prayer is murmured, not dramatically, but out of rhythm and habit.
These gestures do not change the weather. They do not raise the temperature by a single degree, but they change how the night feels. Familiar actions tell the body that the conditions are known, measured, and manageable. One behavior that surfaces in multiple personal accounts is the act of counting. They didn't count sheep. That's a nursery rhyme concept. They counted breaths. They counted heartbeats. They counted the slow, rhythmic crackle of the embers dying in the stove. People did this without naming it as a psychological technique. They simply noticed it worked. Counting gave the mind something solid to hold on to, a numerical handle that prevented thoughts from spiraling into imagined dangers. The cold left little room for unnecessary thoughts.
There has never been full agreement among historians about how often frontier nights were actively disrupted by fear versus how often fear was simply anticipated and controlled. What is clear is that people developed internal technologies to quiet themselves that did not rely on external comforts. There were no stories read aloud to soothe the nerves. There was no music played after dark. Calm came from inward focus. You feel this shift happen now. At first, your mind scans the room for problems like a checklist. Is the fire steady? Is the door secure? Is everyone breathing evenly? Once these questions answer themselves, your thoughts soften. You allow the uncertainty of the storm to exist without chasing it. That acceptance costs less energy than worry. Children learned this emotional regulation by watching the adults. When the elders stayed composed, the children mirrored them. Panic was contagious in a small cabin, but so was calm. This quiet modeling mattered in close quarters. One frightened person could unsettle the entire room. One steady presence could anchor it. Outside, the cold remains indifferent. It does not threaten you, nor does it retreat. It simply exists. Inside, fear loses its edge as familiarity replaces imagination. The night behaves the way it did yesterday and the way it did the day before. That repetition builds trust. You take one more slow breath, then another. Muscles loosen incrementally. The tension that crept in without announcement fades the same way. Fear does not vanish. That would be dangerous. It is acknowledged, categorized, and set aside like a tool you don't need right now. Sleep here is not the absence of fear. It is the decision not to feed it. And as your body settles into that decision, rest becomes deep, steady, and unremarkable, carried forward by practiced calm. You notice the children first because of where they are placed. They are never at the edges. They are never near the walls. They sleep in the geographical center of the room, the thermal core, where heat gathers and drafts struggle to reach. This arrangement appears so often in winter recollections that it barely needed explanation at the time. People did not frame it as tenderness, they framed it as sense. Smaller bodies have less mass and lose warmth faster. Everyone knew this without needing to say it aloud. You lie nearby and feel how the room organizes itself around that idea. The adults position themselves outward, forming a living human barrier between the cold air and the center. Blankets overlap more carefully there. Coats are folded and tucked along the perimeter to create a seal. Someone shifts just enough to block a faint draft creeping along the floorboards. These movements happen quietly, almost instinctively. No one gives instructions. Experience handles the logistics. If you read enough frontier letters, a pattern quietly emerges. Parents often described sleeping lightly, not because they were anxious, but because they were attentive. A child's breathing pattern mattered. A sudden cough mattered. Warmth was monitored the way the fire was monitored, not obsessively, but consistently. One small custom that appears in several regions involved placing children head to toe rather than side by side. The theory was that shared warmth distributed more evenly across the bed that way. Whether this actually improved heat retention is scientifically unclear, but families repeated the practice often enough to suggest it felt right. Comfort did not require proof, it required results. There remains uncertainty among modern researchers about how these communal arrangements shaped children's sleep patterns long term. Some suggest it encouraged deep resilience. Others think it simply reflected necessity, with no lasting psychological imprint. What is certain is that children adapted quickly. They learned to sleep through noise, closeness, and cold in ways that would surprise a modern observer. You hear a child stir, then resettle. An adult adjusts a blanket without waking fully. This responsiveness was learned in environments where nights could turn dangerous quietly. Ignoring a change in the room was not an option. Yet this vigilance rarely tipped into alarm. It was gentle, practiced, almost automatic. Children were also taught stillness early. Wiggling wasted warmth. Kicking uncovered others. These lessons were not harsh. They were absorbed through repetition. A whispered reminder, a hand placed reassuringly on a shoulder to still a restless sleeper. Over time, bodies learned where to rest and how to remain there. You reflect briefly on how different this feels from modern sleep ideals. Privacy, personal space, total silence. None of those define safety here. Safety comes from arrangement, from awareness, from shared responsibility. Being close does not feel confining, it feels protective. The room holds steady. The children breathe evenly again. The adults settle back into deeper rest. The system works because everyone understands their place within it. As your own breathing slows, you sense the quiet confidence in these patterns. They have been tested many nights before this one. You trust them without effort, and with that trust, sleep deepens, centered where warmth and care quietly gather. You are aware of the animals, even though they are not in the room with you. Their presence sits just beyond the walls, close enough to feel, but far enough to remain separate. In frontier towns, livestock were not distant assets kept out of sight in a pasture. They were part of the nightly thermal equation. Barns were placed deliberately near homes, sometimes attached as a lean-to, sometimes sharing a common wall, and sometimes just close enough that the massive body heat of the animals carried faintly through packed earth and timber. You sense it in the air, a subtle difference in temperature on the side of the room nearest the stable, a faint, familiar smell layered beneath the smoke and wool. People rarely commented on this directly because it was ordinary. Horses, cows, goats, even chickens produced warmth simply by existing. That biological heat softened the night in ways that mattered during the coldest stretches of January. You listen and hear them too. Not loudly, a shift of weight, a low exhale, the soft scrape of a hoof, or the rustle of straw. These sounds are not unsettling. They are reassuring. Animals make noise when they are alive and calm. Silence from the barn would have been far more alarming than movement. People learned this quickly, tuning their ears to these rhythms the same way they listened to the wind and the fire. There is a small detail that surfaces again and again in winter memories. Families preferred animals close enough to hear, but not close enough to smell strongly. Too much proximity meant dampness and disease. Too little meant lost warmth and delayed awareness if something went wrong. Finding the right distance took trial and error, and once found, it was rarely changed. You notice how this arrangement shaped sleep. Knowing the animals were nearby reduced anxiety. Livestock reacted to weather shifts and predators faster than people did. A restless horse or a sudden commotion in the coop
could serve as an early warning system long before human senses caught up. This quiet partnership allowed people to rest more deeply, trusting that they would not be entirely surprised by the night. There has never been a single explanation for why frontier settlers felt safer with animals close, only a general agreement that they did. Some later observers framed it as practicality. Others suggested it was emotional. The truth likely sits somewhere in between. Animals were warmth, alarm system, and familiar presence all at once. You think briefly about how different this feels from modern ideas of hygiene and separation. Here, life overlaps. Boundaries are softer. Survival blurs the categories. The night does not care whether warmth comes from fire, food, fabric, or living bodies nearby. It all counts. As you lie still, the sounds outside settle into a steady pattern. Nothing urgent, nothing unusual, just life continuing quietly in the dark. That steadiness allows your muscles to loosen a little more. The room feels anchored, connected to the world beyond its walls rather than isolated from it. The animals shift again, then go still. Their warmth remains. Their presence remains. You let that quiet reassurance sink in. Sleep comes more easily knowing you are not alone in keeping watch over the night, even if the watchers have 4 legs and breathe steam into the cold air outside.
You begin to sense time differently here. Without the harsh standardization of lamps or clocks to dictate the hours, the night stretches and contracts according to the weather rather than the hands of a watch. In frozen frontier towns, people did not go to bed at a fixed numeric time like 10 p.m. They went when the conditions suggested it was right. A rising wind, a thickening sky, or the way the bitter cold settled into the valley earlier than expected. These environmental cues mattered far more than any measured hour. As you lie there, you feel how the weather presses its own schedule onto the human body. Heavy snow dampens sound and encourages a hibernation like stillness. Clear, star-bright nights sharpen the cold and shorten patience. A sudden violent drop in temperature wakes you briefly, not in alarm, but in primal awareness. People living this way learned to recognize these shifts in their sleep. Even while unconscious, the body responded before the mind fully understood why. You notice moonlight when it appears, not as brightness, but as texture. It changes the quality of the darkness, adding deep contrast to the shadows on the log walls. In towns without streetlights, the moon was a functional tool.
People remembered its phases because it dictated movement, travel, and sleep quality. A bright wolf moon reflecting off the snow could wake you as easily as a noise. Conversely, the ink-black darkness of a new moon made the night feel deeper and heavier. There is a habit mentioned quietly in several winter recollections. Some people positioned their sleeping pallets to catch the moonlight deliberately, believing it made waking easier or helped orient them if they stirred in the confusion of the night. Others avoided it entirely, hanging heavy quilts to ensure complete darkness. No single preference dominated. What mattered was knowing how light interacted with your rest. The weather also decided the duration of sleep. Storms lengthened the nights. People stayed down longer, conserving calories and energy, listening to the wind scour the roof. Clear, brutal mornings pulled people up earlier, even when the rest felt unfinished. This rhythm was not disciplined, it was responsive. The day began when conditions allowed, not when a bell rang. Later, observers struggled to categorize this way of sleeping. Some described it as irregular. Others called it adaptive. The truth is simpler. Sleep followed the environment because resisting it cost too much energy. When winter controlled the daylight, it controlled the rest as well.
You feel this now, as your own sense of time loosens its grip. Minutes blur into hours. The night feels wide and unbroken. There is no pressure to wake, nor to sleep deeply. Both are acceptable states. Rest here is not measured in hours, but in readiness. The wind shifts outside. You hear a sheet of snow slide from a roof somewhere nearby with a soft whoosh. That sound marks time more clearly than any ticking clock. It tells you the night is still moving, even as you lie still within it. Eventually, the weather settles. The cold stabilizes. The house holds its temperature. Your body follows suit. Sleep deepens naturally, guided by forces larger than routine or preference. In the morning, when it comes, you will wake not because an alarm demands it, but because light, cold, and sound together suggest it is time. For now, the night remains in control. You accept that easily, and with that acceptance, rest settles fully in. Dreams arrive differently when the cold never fully lets go. They are thinner, more fragmented, slipping in and out between shallow waking moments. You notice this as you drift, the way images form and dissolve without building a deep narrative. In frozen frontier towns, people often described dreaming as lighter and less immersive, especially during the deep winter months. Sleep was rest, but it was not surrender. You slip into a dream and back out again without resistance. A face appears. A place half remembered flashes by. Then the sensation of cold at your feet pulls you closer to waking. This cycle repeats quietly. It does not feel disruptive. It feels normal. The body checks its surroundings, confirms safety, then allows the mind to wander again. People living this way rarely wrote about elaborate, fantastical dreams in winter. When they did mention them in journals, they were brief, practical, familiar scenes rather than wild fantasies. Some later readers assumed this meant poorer sleep quality, but others suggested it reflected a different balance. The mind did not roam far because the body needed to stay partially alert. Neither state fully dominated. There is a small detail that surfaces in scattered personal writings. Some settlers claimed they dreamed more vividly in summer, when nights were warm and bodies could relax their thermal guard completely. Winter dreams, by contrast, were described as pale or fleeting. No one at the time tried to explain this scientifically. They simply noticed the pattern and accepted it as part of the season. You feel how the cold shapes your imagination. Sensations intrude gently. A numb toe, a tightening blanket, a distant sound from the barn. Each one pulls you back just enough to blur the boundary between dreaming and waking. Modern sleep studies might label this fragmented rest. Here, it was simply winter sleep. You turn slightly in a dream, then stop yourself in reality. Movement costs warmth. Even while dreaming, the body remembers this rule. Muscles stay restrained. Positions are held longer. This stillness shapes the dream itself. Images slow down. Actions feel deliberate. Nothing rushes. There is no single explanation for how this affected memory or emotional life. Some later thinkers believed lighter dreaming made the winter feel shorter, as the nights passed in a series of blinks. Others believed it dulled the imagination. What remains clear is that people adapted without complaint. The mind followed the body's needs. You drift again. This time, the dream holds a little longer. A familiar task,
chopping wood, mending a fence, walking a path traveled many times. These are not escapes, they are extensions of waking life, the same places, the same concerns. Sleep does not transport you elsewhere, it keeps you close to home. As the night continues, the line between dreaming and resting blurs further. You may not remember these dreams at all by morning. Many people did not. They woke with a sense of having rested, not of having traveled through stories. Your breathing stays steady. The room remains unchanged. Outside, the cold persists, indifferent to what passes through your mind. Inside, your body maintains its careful balance between rest and readiness.
Eventually, even the thin dreams fade. What remains is a quiet, sustained stillness. Not deep unconsciousness, but something sufficient, something that restores just enough strength to face another cold day. You remain there, suspended between sleep and awareness, letting the night pass through you without resistance until rest settles into its most useful form. Illness feels closer at night, even when no one is actively sick. In frozen frontier towns, darkness amplified every small bodily change. A cough sounded louder in the silence. A fever felt more dangerous when you couldn't see the flush on a cheek. Pain seemed sharper when there was nothing else to distract from it. You sense this vulnerability as you lie still, aware that the night strips away the small comforts and distractions that daytime activity provides. People feared sickness after dark, not because it spread faster then, but because help was exponentially harder to reach. Roads were impassable snowdrifts. Neighbors were asleep behind bolted doors. Doctors, if they existed at all in the region, were miles away. This awareness shaped how people listened to their own bodies and the bodies of their family at night. Breathing was noticed. Skin temperature was checked with the back of a hand in the dark. Changes were tracked quietly until morning came. You feel how the room responds when someone does not settle easily. A restless shift, a breath that catches in the throat. Others in the room register it without fully waking. This attentiveness was learned early. In places where a common illness could turn fatal quickly, ignoring small signs felt reckless. Yet panic did not dominate, observation did. One habit that appears in winter memories is the practice of keeping simple remedies within arm's reach at night. A tin cup ready for water, a clean cloth folded nearby, a bit of dried herb or camphor tucked into a pocket or hung in a sachet. These items offered reassurance as much as treatment. Knowing something could be done immediately made it easier to rest. No one fully agreed on why some people succumbed to illness while others endured the same freezing conditions without trouble. Some blamed the drafts, others blamed dampness or fatigue. Many simply accepted that chance played a role. What mattered more was the response. Warmth was added, fluids were offered, sleep was protected as best it could be. You notice how sickness changed sleeping arrangements when it appeared. The ill were placed closer to the heat source, sometimes given the best bedding available while the healthy sacrificed theirs. Others adjusted their positions around them without complaint. Comfort became collective rather than individual. This flexibility kept communities functioning through long winters. Children learned quickly that the night brought different rules when someone was unwell. Voices softened even further, movement slowed to a minimum.
The entire room conspired to create a healing stillness. Even the fire is tended with a new, specific caution. The house narrows its entire focus to preservation. As you lie there, healthy for now, you feel the quiet respect people had for night illness. It was not dramatized, it was managed. Fear existed, certainly, but it was shaped into watchfulness rather than alarm. Eventually, the room settles again. Breathing evens out into a collective rhythm. No new sounds demand attention. The night resumes its steady, heavy pulse. You release the tension in your jaw and shoulders that you did not realize you were holding. Sleep returns, carrying with it the profound understanding that health in this place was guarded not by medicine alone, but by awareness, adaptation, and the simple act of staying close through the dark hours. Small comforts matter more when nothing else is generous. You discover this slowly as the night stretches on. In frozen frontier towns, comfort did not arrive in large, sweeping gestures. It showed up in tiny, microscopic adjustments that made rest slightly easier to hold. A folded cloth placed just so under a hip, a knot in the ticking retied so it would not press into the skin. A piece of firewood shifted 3 inches to block a draft that barely registered but never quite left you alone.
People became experts in these small improvements. They noticed exactly what bothered them and learned how to soften it with whatever was at hand. A wool scarf rolled into a makeshift pillow. A heavy coat tucked along the edge of the bedding to create a thermal seal. An extra board leaned against the north wall where the frost crept in most aggressively. None of this looked impressive. All of it mattered. You feel this process happening now. Something presses uncomfortably at your shoulder, a lump in the straw, perhaps. You shift, then pause to conserve warmth, and adjust just enough to relieve the pressure. The change is subtle, but immediate. Relief settles in. This is how comfort worked here. It was incremental, and it was earned. One thing that appears quietly in many winter recollections is how often people reused objects in unexpected ways at night. Heavy iron tools became weights to hold blankets in place against the wind. Empty flour sacks became draft stoppers. Even books, when a family was lucky enough to own them, were sometimes stacked near the feet to lift the heavy wool slightly off the toes to improve circulation. These choices were not clever in the modern sense. They were obvious once learned.
There was never full agreement on which tricks worked best. People argued casually over the physics of sleep. One swore by extra layers beneath the body to stop the ground cold. Another insisted the weight belonged on top. Some believed absolute stillness preserved warmth best, while others claimed small rhythmic movements prevented numbness. No one resolved these differences. Each household simply settled into what felt right for their specific drafty cabin. You notice how memory plays a role. Comfort builds through repetition. Once you find a position that works, you remember it the next night. The body learns the topography of the bed. The house learns too. Over time, sleeping spaces developed grooves and patterns shaped by repeated use. Straw softened where bodies rested most often. Wood darkened where people leaned to block drafts. You breathe in and smell the familiar materials: wool, rough wood, stale smoke. These scents signal safety. They tell your limbic system that this place has sheltered you before and will likely do so again. Comfort is not softness here, it is recognition. As the night continues, these small adjustments accumulate. Together, they create an environment that supports rest without ever feeling indulgent. You are not pampered, you are accommodated. Your thoughts slow as the physical irritation fades. When the body is content enough, the mind follows. Sleep grows steadier, less interrupted. You no longer scan for discomfort. You trust that you have done what you can. The night holds. The cold remains. But within your small circle of improvised comforts, you find enough ease to rest fully.
And in a place like this, enough is everything. You sense the presence of others who were not expected when the night began. Frontier towns were rarely closed systems, especially in the deep winter. Travelers arrived late, delayed by drifts. Neighbors sought shelter when their own roofs failed or firewood ran low. News carried people along with it. Sleep here had to remain flexible, because the population of a room could change without warning. You hear the heavy timber door open earlier than planned, snow shaken loose from a coat with a soft thud. There is a low exchange of voices, kept intentionally quiet. No one reacts with surprise. This happens often enough that the response is practiced. Space is made immediately. Bedding shifts. Someone scoots closer to the frosted wall. Another person slides a folded blanket outward to expand the sleeping area. There is no debate about whether the newcomer should stay. The question is only where they will fit. Accounts from frontier settlements repeatedly show that refusing a sleeper on a cold night was rare and remembered with shame. Hospitality was not framed as kindness alone. It was self-preservation turned outward. The unspoken law of the winter was simple. Tonight it is them. Tomorrow it could be you. This understanding settles quickly and leaves little room for resentment.
You feel the room adjust around the added body. The heat distribution changes. The airflow shifts slightly. The newcomer brings a smell of fresh cold air and wet wool, but soon they become another source of warmth. Someone coughs and then quiets. The system absorbs the change. Sleep does not stop. It adapts. There is a detail that surfaces in several winter recollections. People often kept extra bedding folded near the door, even when space was tight, not for their own comfort, but for moments like this. A spare blanket meant the difference between rest and danger for someone arriving too late to make it home. These items were not displayed, they were kept ready. No one ever fully agreed on how many people could safely share one room. Some thought crowding risked spreading illness. Others believed shared warmth reduced the risk of freezing. But what mattered more than theory was the outcome. People paid attention to what happened the next morning and adjusted accordingly. You notice how quiet the newcomer becomes once settled. Exhaustion overrides embarrassment. The cold equalizes status completely. A traveler, a neighbor, a stranger, all sleep the same way here, close, still, wrapped in whatever could be spared. The children barely stir. The adults shift just enough to accommodate. Someone checks the fire one last time, ensuring the banking of the embers will last. Then the room settles into a new equilibrium.
You reflect briefly on how different this feels from modern boundaries. Here, privacy bends easily under pressure. The night does not allow for rigid rules. Survival prefers generosity. As breathing evens out again, you feel the warmth increase slightly. Another body adds another margin of safety. The storm outside does not care who belongs here. Inside, belonging is decided quickly and without ceremony. Sleep resumes, layered now with shared purpose. The room holds one more person, and in doing so, holds itself together through another frozen night.
Winter stretches sleep in one direction and compresses it in another. You feel this most clearly as the season deepens toward the solstice. Nights grow longer, but rest does not necessarily grow heavier. Instead, sleep spreads out, broken into stretches that ebb and return. In frontier towns, this rhythm was expected. You were not meant to disappear for 8 uninterrupted, silent hours. You were meant to rest when you could, wake when you needed to, and drift back again without frustration. You notice how the body responds to the sheer length of darkness. At first, you sleep longer simply because there is nothing pulling you up. Work waits for light. Travel waits for weather. Over time, though, you begin to wake naturally in the middle of the night, the watch. You are not alert, not alarmed, just present.
You lie still, listening, breathing, letting thoughts wander gently before sleep returns. This pattern appears quietly in winter life. People spoke of first sleep and second sleep, or dorveil, without ceremony. The space between them was not considered a problem or disorder. It was a pause, a time to check the fire, to murmur a few words to a partner, or to lie awake and think without the pressure of the day. The night was long enough to hold all of it. Seasonal change shaped this rhythm more than habit ever could. Early winter brought restlessness as bodies adjusted to the confinement. Deep winter brought steadiness. The cold enforced a biological stillness. Movement was minimized to preserve calories. Sleep lengthened in small increments, spreading across the darkness like a blanket, rather than falling all at once. You feel this now as your own rest shifts. You wake briefly, reposition a numb limb, then settle again. There is no digital clock to accuse you of wakefulness, no glowing screen to suggest you are doing something wrong. Wakefulness here is neutral. It simply exists. As winter progresses, the body learns when to conserve energy and when to spend it. Sleep becomes less about the schedule and more about the condition. If the night is calm, rest deepens. If the wind rises or the cold sharpens, sleep lightens to monitor the threat. This responsiveness keeps you aligned with the environment rather than fighting it. You sense how this seasonal rhythm affects the mood of the room as well. Long nights invite reflection. Thoughts stretch out, becoming slower and more deliberate. People often spoke less in the depths of winter, not from sadness, but from a necessary inward focus. The quiet of the snow-covered world supported it. Sleep mirrored this inward turn. As the season wears on, your body grows more efficient at this hibernation. You wake less often from the mere discomfort of the mattress or the draft. You recognize the familiar sensations of the cold and learn to ignore them. The sub-zero temperature no longer startles you. The early darkness no longer comes as a surprise. Sleep becomes a practiced state, a discipline, rather than a fragile attempt at rest. Eventually, you know that winter will begin to loosen its grip. The nights will shorten almost imperceptibly. The light will linger a moment longer at dawn, painting the snow in brighter hues. You do not notice this shift immediately, but your body does. Sleep will eventually shift again, growing slightly lighter and shorter without conscious effort. But for now, the season holds. The night remains long. You rest when it allows, and you wake when it asks. This balance feels natural here. You let the rhythm carry you through another stretch of darkness, trusting that rest will return when it is ready. Before sleep fully settles again,
You notice the quiet rituals that surround it. They're small acts, easily missed by an outsider, yet they shape the night as much as the fire or the bedding. In frozen frontier towns, people rarely announced these habits. They simply repeated them, night after night, year after year, until the actions became part of the room itself. Someone touches a doorway lightly with their palm before lying down. Another murmurs a familiar phrase under their breath. It might be a prayer, or it might just be a folk saying passed down without explanation. The specific words matter less than the repetition. Familiar sounds tell the primitive brain that the day has ended and the night has begun safely. You feel how these routines soften the tension in the room. They give the mind something solid to rest against. They do not offer answers or certainty, but they offer continuity. The night behaves the same way it did yesterday. You do the same things you did then. That sameness steadies you against the unpredictable wild. Children absorb these rituals without ever being told their purpose. They learn instinctively when voices drop, when the lamps are lowered, and when movements slow to a crawl. Over time, the sequence itself becomes reassuring. Even when traveling away from home, people carried these habits with them, recreating a sense of shelter wherever they laid their heads.
There is a quiet belief running beneath these actions that acknowledging the night makes it less threatening. People did not really expect these rituals to change the weather or stop an illness. They expected them to change how the night felt, and they often did. You notice how even the skeptics participated. The man who claimed not to believe in prayer still paused for a silent moment before sleep. The woman who laughed at superstition still avoided certain unlucky actions after dark. These were not contradictions, they were accommodations to uncertainty. As you lie there, the final sounds of evening settle into silence. No more movement, no more adjustments. The room feels complete. This sense of completion invites rest more effectively than physical comfort ever could. Your thoughts slow as these familiar gestures echo quietly in your memory. You do not question them. You do not analyze them. You simply let them mark the passage from waking to sleeping. The night responds by feeling less open-ended. It has a shape now, a beginning, a middle, and an eventual end. That knowledge relaxes you. You breathe deeply and allow sleep to return, guided not by explanation, but by a ritual repeated often enough to feel true. You wake again briefly, and this time you do not question it. Broken sleep feels ordinary now. It no longer carries the modern weight of frustration or urgency. In frozen frontier towns, waking during the night was not treated as a problem to solve or a disorder to cure. It was treated as a natural part of rest itself. You lie still, eyes closed, aware but untroubled. The room has not changed. The fire remains quiet, glowing faintly behind the grate. The breathing around you stays slow and steady. Nothing asks for action. This kind of wakefulness exists in a narrow liminal space between effort and ease. You are not fully asleep, but you are not fully awake. You simply are. People living this way expected these moments. They did not reach for distraction or force themselves back into unconsciousness with worry. They waited. Sometimes they thought quietly, solving problems that seemed impossible during the day. Sometimes they simply listened to the wind. Sometimes they checked on the small things that mattered: the edge of a blanket, the rhythm of a child's breathing, the color of the fire's glow. Then, satisfied that the world was holding together, they lay back and let sleep return when it was ready.
You notice how your body handles this pause. Muscles remain relaxed. Breath stays deep. There is no spike of adrenaline or alertness. Modern habits train the mind to react sharply to the act of waking, a sudden jolt back to reality. Here, waking was neutral. It carried no meaning beyond simple awareness.
This acceptance shaped how the nights felt overall. Without the crushing pressure to sleep perfectly for 8 solid hours, rest arrived more gently. Sleep came in layers rather than solid blocks. You gathered it gradually, the way warmth returns slowly to cold hands. You drift again, not because you force yourself, but because nothing holds you awake. Thoughts thin out, sensations soften, the boundary dissolves without announcement. Later, you may wake once more, or you may not. Either outcome is fine. The night is long enough to hold both. You settle back into stillness, confident that rest will continue in whatever shape it takes. And with that quiet confidence, sleep deepens once more, carrying you forward without effort. You wake, finally, not because you want to, but because the quality of the cold light has changed. It does not arrive suddenly. It seeps in, thinning the darkness like water diluting ink, until shapes begin to separate themselves from the shadows. Morning in a frozen frontier town announces itself quietly, long before anyone moves. Your eyes open a fraction, then close again, testing whether the day is truly ready for you. There is no alarm, no sharp mechanical sound to pull you upright. Waking here is gradual. The body rises first, then the mind follows. You notice the stiffness in your joints, a physical reminder of how still you have been to conserve heat. Fingers curl slowly, toes flex tentatively inside layers of wool. You do not rush. Rushing wastes the warmth you have spent hours accumulating. Someone nearby stirs. A blanket shifts with a heavy rustle. Another breath changes rhythm from the long, slow draw of sleep to the shorter, sharper intake of waking. These small signals pass through the room like a shared understanding. The night is loosening its grip. It is not gone yet, but it is easing. You sit up part way and feel the air touch your face. It is colder than it was hours ago. Fires naturally cool toward morning. Embers fade to gray ash. This is the thermal debt of the frontier. The night always takes back the warmth it borrowed. People learn to greet this chilly moment calmly rather than resent it. The room smells different now. The smoke is lighter, stale, and settled. The fabric of the bedding feels slightly heavy and damp from the moisture of breath and bodies. The wood walls carry a clean, sharp, frozen scent. These are markers of morning as reliable as sunlight. You move carefully, keeping your layers on. The clothing that served you through the night continues its work now. Nothing is removed until the heat of the room is restored. Someone tends the fire again, coaxing life back into the dormant embers with a handful of kindling. The first crackle of the wood feels louder than it should. Sound is always amplified after hours of absolute quiet. Children wake slower than adults. They are checked gently, a hand to the forehead, a tuck of the quilt, before being pulled away from the warmth. The heat is protected until movement can replace it. You stand fully and feel the weight of the night in your body. It is not exhaustion, it is accumulation. Sleep has done its work, even if it did not look like modern rest. You feel ready enough. In this life, that is the only measure that matters. Outside, the town exhales. Doors open cautiously, breaking the seal of the night. Snow crunches dryly under heavy boots. Breath clouds the air,
turning every person into a temporary engine of steam. Morning does not promise comfort, it promises continuation. You take one last moment inside, letting the memory of the shared warmth settle in your mind. The night has passed, another will come. For now, the day waits, and you step toward it, steady and rested in the way winter allows. As you move into the day, you notice how easily memory reshapes these nights when spoken aloud later. People often remembered frontier sleep as harsher, colder, or simpler than it actually was. In the retelling, the cold grew sharper, the darkness became thicker, the discomfort became absolute. Yet, living through it felt different. It was not constant suffering. It was adaptation repeated until it felt ordinary.
You sense this difference now as you reflect quietly. The night was cold, yes. It asked things of you, but it also offered rhythms, routines, and moments of ease that do not survive neatly in historical memory. When people spoke about winter years later, they often compressed whole seasons into a few extreme moments. The blizzard that buried the barn, the fever that swept the house, the long stretches of functional, quiet rest disappeared between them. This gap between memory and experience shaped how frontier life was later imagined. Stories favored endurance and hardship because those made for better narratives. Few people talked about the calm nights when everything worked as it should, but most nights were exactly that, functional, quiet, and uneventful. Sleep did its job without drama. It held the house together. It held the people together. And in the silence of the frozen frontier, that was the greatest comfort of all.